There is something you have been meaning to say. Not to everyone, to a specific person in a specific relationship, about a specific thing that has been sitting between you for longer than you want to calculate. You have rehearsed it. You have found the right moment several times and let it pass. You have told yourself it is not the right time, that it will make things harder, that you are probably being too sensitive, that the relationship is fine enough without the conversation. But the thing is still there. And it is taking up exactly the space that something more real could occupy. This audiobook is about unspoken words, not the trivial ones, the half-formed thoughts and passing feelings that genuinely do not need expression. The ones that matter, the honest assessment of a relationship that has been packaged as fine for years, the need that has been swallowed so many times it has almost become invisible, the appreciation that was felt but never spoken because vulnerability felt like too much exposure, the boundary that has been wished for but never stated, the love that was assumed rather than named. These words, present, felt, chronically unspoken, are among the most significant forces in any human life. What we do not say shapes our lives as powerfully as what we do say, sometimes more powerfully, because the unspoken word does not disappear. It stays in the body, in the space between people, in the gap between the relationship as it is and the relationship as it could be if the words were finally found. Part 1. Why We Go Silent. The psychologist James Pennebaker has spent decades studying what happens to people when they carry significant experiences without speaking or writing about them. His research produced findings that were striking in their consistency. People who habitually inhibit the expression of significant thoughts and feelings show measurably elevated physiological stress markers. The act of inhibition, of actively holding back, requires sustained effort. It is not a neutral act. It is a continuous, energy-consuming suppression that taxes the immune system, elevates baseline cortisol, and over time contributes to a range of health outcomes that correlate with chronic stress. The silence is not passive. It is a constant action. Every time the unsaid thing surfaces in consciousness and is pushed back down, the suppression costs something. Every time the honest response is replaced with the managed one, the gap between the interior life and the expressed life widens. Over years, this gap becomes the primary experience of certain relationships. The persistent, low-level sense that you are not quite present in your own life, that the real you is somewhere slightly behind the person who shows up. Why do we go silent? The reasons are as varied as the unsaid things themselves, but they cluster around a small number of themes. Fear of the response, the anticipation that the honest word will be met with anger, withdrawal, contempt, or the loss of the relationship. Fear of being wrong, the uncertainty about whether what you feel is accurate enough to justify the disruption of expressing it. Fear of being too much, the belief, often installed early and rarely examined, that your needs and feelings and honest responses are a burden that the people in your life should not be asked to bear. The philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote about the tyranny of the prevailing opinion, the way that social pressure toward conformity silences the minority view not through force, but through the subtler mechanism of making deviation feel dangerous, costly, and socially ruinous. The same tyranny operates in intimate life. The prevailing opinion in a relationship, the implicit agreement about what can and cannot be said, silences the divergent truth not through prohibition, but through the accumulated weight of all the times the divergent truth was tested and found to produce difficulty. The silence, once established, becomes self-reinforcing. The longer the unsaid thing stays unsaid, the more weight it accumulates, and the more impossible it seems to say it after such a long silence. How do you raise something now that you have not raised in 10 years? How do you say this has always bothered me when the implicit message of not saying it for a decade has been that it does not? The accumulation of the unsaid creates a debt that feels impossible to settle. And so the silence continues, and the debt grows, and the distance between the expressed and the lived life widens. Understanding why we go silent is the beginning of choosing differently. Not because the fears are groundless, sometimes they are entirely accurate, and the relationship will respond badly to the honest word, but because carrying the unsaid thing has its own costs, which the silence tends to conceal behind the apparent peace of the uninterrupted surface. The question is not whether speaking or not speaking involves risk. It always involves risk, in both directions. The question is which risk you are willing to live with, and whether the relationship you have in the silence is actually preferable to the relationship that the honest word might make possible. Part 2. What the unspoken costs. The relationship that contains many unspoken things is not a relationship without them. The unsaid words do not disappear into silence. They become the atmosphere of the relationship, present as a quality of restraint, a managed distance, a persistent sense that something is always slightly off but cannot be named. The people in the relationship may not be able to articulate it, but they feel it. The conversations that always skirt the edge of the real topic. The ease that is slightly too careful to be genuine ease. The closeness that is somehow always bounded by an invisible wall that neither person has built, and both have agreed not to name. Research on relationship quality consistently identifies authenticity, the degree to which people feel able to be themselves in a relationship, as one of the most powerful predictors of satisfaction and longevity. Not the absence of conflict, not the presence of agreement. The felt sense that who you are, including the inconvenient parts, is welcome in the relationship. That the relationship is large enough to contain your honest truth. That you do not have to manage yourself into palatability in order to maintain the connection. Relationships that require sustained self-management, in which significant parts of the self must be kept offline to maintain the peace, produce a specific quality of loneliness that is in some ways the most painful kind. The loneliness of being with someone and not being known by them, of being liked for a performance, of occupying the same space as another person while the actual self remains, carefully and chronically, behind the performance. This loneliness can coexist with genuine affection, with goodwill, even with love. It is not the absence of love that produces it. It is the insufficient room for the full self. The therapist Terry Real, writing about the dynamics of intimate relationships, describes what he calls the dance of connection and distance, the way that couples, families, and close friendships develop implicit choreographies around what can and cannot be said, drawing together when the unspoken territory is avoided and drifting apart when one person approaches it. The unspoken things become the choreographer. They determine the shape of every interaction. And the people in the relationship are, without usually knowing it, dancing a dance whose steps were written by everything they have agreed not to say. The cost accumulates over time in ways that are hard to see because they compound slowly. The friendship that was close once and is now pleasant but never quite real. The marriage that functions well by every practical measure but carries a low-level flatness that neither person can fully explain. The parent-child relationship that is warm and regular but that has never reached the depth that both people could feel was possible. In each of these, somewhere in the history, there were words that were not spoken. Moments when the honest thing was available and the managed thing was chosen. Not once, dramatically, but repeatedly in small ways until the pattern became the relationship. None of this is irreversible. The relationship shaped by years of silence does not have to remain in that shape forever, but it cannot change without the words that were not spoken beginning, gradually and carefully to be spoken. Without someone, and it usually only needs to be one person being willing to move toward the real thing rather than the managed surface. To say the thing that has been waiting. To test, gently but honestly, whether the relationship is larger than its current shape. Often it is. Often the other person has been waiting too, with their own unspoken words, for exactly the same permission. Part 3. The art of the honest conversation. The honest conversation is not the same as the uninhibited conversation. The release of everything you have been thinking all at once, without consideration of timing, context, or the other person's capacity to receive it. That is not honesty. It is a transfer of burden. The honest conversation is something more careful, more considered, more genuinely respectful of both the truth and the relationship. It is the art of saying the difficult true thing in a way that can actually be heard. The philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti wrote about the art of listening, the quality of attention that makes it possible to truly hear another person, rather than simply waiting for them to finish so you can respond. The same quality is required for the honest conversation to be genuine, rather than merely confrontational. The person bringing the difficult truth needs to be genuinely interested in what the other person hears, genuinely curious about the response, genuinely willing to be wrong about part of their perception. Without that quality of openness, the honest conversation becomes a monologue wearing the costume of dialogue. The researcher John Gottman, in his decades of work on what makes conversations in close relationships productive rather than destructive, identified what he called the softened startup as one of the most reliable predictors of whether a difficult conversation will open a relationship or close it further. Not softened in the sense of dishonest or hedged, but softened in the sense of beginning with what you feel and need rather than with what the other person has done wrong. The difference between I have been feeling distant from you, and I don't know why, and I think you have been shutting me out. The first opens the conversation. The second begins it in a defensive crouch. There is a quality that every truly honest conversation requires that is harder to develop than any specific communication skill. It is the genuine willingness to be changed by what the other person says. To enter the conversation not with a prepared verdict that you are delivering, but with an actual question whose answer you are genuinely open to. Because the honest conversation at its best is not a delivery. It is an inquiry. Two people together looking at something real. Neither of them entirely certain what they will find. Both of them willing to have their understanding of the situation revised by what the conversation reveals. The timing of the honest conversation matters more than most people allow, not in the sense of waiting for the perfect moment that never arrives, that is avoidance in the costume of care, but in the sense of choosing a time when both people have the emotional bandwidth to be genuinely present with something difficult, not at the end of an exhausting day, not in the middle of another conflict, not under time pressure. A moment of genuine availability, when both people can be there fully for the duration of what the conversation needs. And the conversation does not have to be complete in a single sitting. Often the most important thing the first honest conversation accomplishes is the opening, the establishment that this topic is speakable, that the relationship can hold this truth, that the person across from you can meet the real thing rather than only the managed version. From that opening, subsequent conversations can go deeper, with less of the initial cost of breaking a long silence. The first honest word is the hardest. What follows it is the relationship finding its actual size. Part 4. What happens when you finally say it? The anticipated response to the honest word is almost always worse than the actual response. Not always. Sometimes the anticipated difficulty arrives exactly as predicted, and the relationship is indeed not large enough to hold the truth. But in the majority of cases, across the research and across the ordinary testimony of people who have finally said the thing they were not saying, the response was more generous, more understanding, more relieved than the fear had predicted. Because the other person, in most cases, already knew, already felt the weight of the unsaid thing, already wanted the conversation to go somewhere real. The relief that follows the honest conversation is physiologically real. Pennebaker's research showed that the act of expressing significant emotional content, in writing, in speech, in any form that takes it from the interior to the exterior, produces measurable reductions in physiological stress markers. The sustained suppression effort ends. The energy that was going into the management of the unsaid thing is released. What remains is not necessarily resolution. The conversation may open questions that take time to work through, but it is a different quality of presence, the sense of being in the actual relationship rather than the managed facsimile of it. For some relationships, the honest word is the beginning of a depth that was not accessible before, the friendship that becomes genuinely close after the first real conversation, the marriage that finds a new quality after the first honest accounting of what has been missing, the parent-child relationship that shifts register when the adult child finally says the thing that has been between them for decades. These shifts are not dramatic in the moment. They are often quiet, tentative, uncertain in their early stages, but they are real, and they compound. Each honest exchange makes the next one easier, and the relationship gradually finds its actual size rather than the carefully managed smaller version it had been occupying. For other relationships, the honest word reveals that the relationship was not, in fact, large enough to hold it, that what the managed surface was maintaining was an agreement, explicit or implicit, to not require too much of each other, that the peace was contingent on the avoidance. This revelation is painful, but it is also clarifying. It is better to know clearly what a relationship is than to remain indefinitely in the comfortable ambiguity of the unspoken. And the knowledge, even when what it reveals is a limitation, frees you from the specific loneliness of performing a closeness that was never quite real. The words you have been carrying have weight that the carrying has obscured. You have been so accustomed to the weight that it has become part of your baseline, and you have forgotten that there was a time before it. The putting down of it, the moment when the thing that has been unsaid is finally said, carefully and honestly and with genuine openness to the response, produces a lightness that is initially disorienting, like removing a pack you have been wearing so long you forgot it was there. The disorientation passes. What remains is the space where the weight was. And that space, in a relationship that proves large enough to hold the truth, fills with something more real than what it replaced. You do not have to say everything at once. You do not have to say it perfectly. You do not have to be certain of the outcome before you begin. You only have to begin with the smallest true thing, spoken as carefully and as honestly as you can, in a moment when both of you have room for it. That beginning is the whole of what is required. From it, if the relationship is what you hope it is, everything else becomes possible. And if it is not, then at least you will have learned that, and the carrying will finally be over. Part 5. The practice of speaking your truth. Speaking your truth is not a single act. It is a practice, a lifelong, daily, repeatedly renewed commitment to closing the gap between what you experience internally and what you express externally. Not eliminating the gap entirely. Some interior life is genuinely private and belongs only to you, but refusing to allow the gap to widen beyond a certain point. Refusing to let the managed life drift so far from the actual life that you lose contact with the difference between them. The first element of the practice is the development of what we might call internal honesty. Before you can speak your truth to another person, you need to know what it is. This sounds obvious and is rarely done carefully. Most people have a general sense of their emotional state but have not examined it closely enough to know specifically what they feel, what they need, and what the honest response to the situation actually is. The practice of journaling, of deliberate internal inquiry, of sitting quietly with the question, what am I actually experiencing? These are not luxuries. They are the prerequisite for the honest conversation. You cannot speak clearly what you have not first seen clearly. The second element is the development of what psychologists call assertiveness. Not aggression, not conflict seeking, but the calm, clear, self-respecting expression of your perspective, your needs, and your honest response to what is happening. Assertiveness rests on two beliefs that many people have difficulty genuinely holding simultaneously: that your perspective is valid and worth expressing, and that the other person's perspective is also valid and worth hearing. Both. Not one at the expense of the other. The assertive person is not trying to win. They are trying to make contact, to bring their actual self into contact with the actual other person in the specific situation and see what is possible from that contact. The philosopher Martin Buber's distinction between I-thou and I-it relationships applies here directly. The honest conversation is an I-thou encounter, one in which both people are fully present as subjects, neither reduced to a function or a role, both genuinely available to be changed by the meeting. The managed conversation, in which both people are playing roles, avoiding the real topic, performing a version of closeness that stops short of genuine contact, is an I-it interaction. More comfortable, more predictable, and completely unable to provide what genuine connection requires. The third element is tolerance for the discomfort of the honest moment. Every significant truth-speaking carries its own particular anxiety. The moment before the words are said, when the outcome is still unknown and the managed alternative is still available. This moment is the gate. On one side of it, the familiar management and its familiar costs. On the other side, the actual relationship and whatever that turns out to be. The capacity to move through the gate, to say the thing despite the anxiety, because the value of the saying outweighs the comfort of the silence, is the core skill of a life lived in genuine contact with itself and others. The words you have been not saying are not gone. They are waiting, in the spaces between you and the people who matter most, in the gap between the life you are living and the life that is available, in the particular quiet of moments when you knew the real thing and chose the safe thing instead. The practice is the slow, patient, daily choosing of the real thing. Not always, not perfectly, but increasingly often with increasing confidence, with the growing evidence of a life becoming more genuinely its own. That evidence compounds. The honest life, built one spoken truth at a time, becomes the only life you can imagine living. And looking back at the silence, you will wonder what you were protecting it for.